Hello, and welcome to this week's Credible Live broadcast. As always, I'm here with our CEO and chairman, Brian Fitzpatrick. And this week we are joined by a very special guest, Herb Barbot.
Thank you.
Herb was the former and first director of operations for the New York State Office of Cannabis Management. He's here with us today to share insights from his extensive experience in cannabis regulation, especially in healthcare law and operational leadership, and to talk about navigating evolving regulations and building trust with emerging markets. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Herb. To get us started, could you tell us a little bit more about your background and the work that you're currently doing?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's quite a mouthful that you said there. So hopefully we'll cover a lot of that in the next 30 minutes. My background is I'm an attorney. In practice, most of my work was in healthcare, and I worked in all the different from providers at hospital systems, at federally qualified health centers, for insurance companies. I worked for a subsidiary of New York Life, for Aetna U.S. Healthcare. And then I was always going back and forth between the private sector and government. And at some point, I decided to stay in government, and then also switched from the legal to the operational. It just something that was different and exciting to be on sort of the operational side instead of giving the advice, being the one that was needed the advice. So it was great.
And the legal and the operational go hand in hand in this industry, don't they?
No, absolutely. And when you're on the legal side, if you don't understand what's happening operationally, you really can't give, quality advice. So you do understand what the operational aspects are, and the difficulties that people in operations face and the challenges that they have.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good lead-in to sort of you giving us a good understanding about sort of the New York cannabis landscape, because we've seen a lot, and from that early phase to even to some of the more controversial, most recent things going on in New York. So I think it'd be helpful if you can discuss a little bit of the kind of the early formation and the challenges that the Office of Cannabis Management in New York sort of went through in that unique regulatory environment.
Yeah. No, well, first, this is something. The issues that we faced in New York are not unique to New York. It's the issues that you see across the board. Just yesterday I was reading an article about Minnesota and Minnesota's Office of Cannabis Management, and the headline is what is wrong with the Office of Cannabis Management, which piqued my interest, and then I realized they were talking about Minnesota.
Right.
But it's the same issue. So, I would like to start with where we are today, because it will sort of give you that baseline and an understanding that despite all those troubles, that the industry is a robust industry in New York, and it's growing and it's exciting. And so I'll just start with that. So I'll look down because I have some notes. So today we have 213 dispensaries that are open across the state. On Fridays, they usually release the new openings, and it's always between 3 and 7 stores. So we'll be very close to 220 by the end of the day. And in 6 months, that's 100%. That's 100 store increase from where we were at the end of April. So if we keep that pace up, it's incredible what we'll experience in 2025. So that's 213 dispensaries. 1,100 licenses, over 1,100 licenses issued across the supply chain. In sales, last year in 2023, there was $160 million in sales, and that was with about 27 stores. Year to date, as New York was approaching the 200th store, sales were $700 million, and the third quarter alone was $250 million. So easily would be $1 billion industry. In the next 3 or 4 years, easily, we're expecting $4 to $5 billion industry. And then, in keeping with the mandate of the New York State law, the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, 53% of those licensees are social and economic equity licensees. So very successful in that regard as well. The history, the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, which we call the MRTA or MARTA, was signed into law on it was March 31st, 2021 by then Governor Mario Cuomo. By August of that year, 2 months later, Governor Cuomo resigned, and Governor Hochul, the lieutenant governor, came in. At that point, there still was nothing but the legislation. Governor Hochul, by September, named the board, the 5-member Cannabis Control Board, named an executive director. The chair of the board and the executive director had to be approved by the New York Senate. That was done. The beginning of October, the Cannabis Control Board held its first meeting, and in that meeting hired the first 20 people. I was one of those 20 people that came on to be the director of operations. And at OCM, that the director of operations, I was responsible for licensing, compliance, and enforcement. Really, to me, the heart and soul of the agency. I mean, there's a lot of other things that go on, but if you're not licensing, if you're not ensuring compliance, and you're not doing enforcement, then you're in trouble. So we were named in October, but we didn't start actually working, just because that takes time, until December 1st of 2021. And then we started. At that point, we had no office. We were working out of another agency's conference room. I would say we had no copiers, we had no printers, we had no computers. We just had this incredible desire to get this thing going. And it's highly unusual to have a state agency start, right? I mean, state agencies have been in place for a long time. Sometimes what happens is a couple of them get merged, like we have Division of Financial Services in New York State, which is a combination of the former banking and insurance agencies. And I think that was the last time that something new was created, but something from scratch with no staff. I don't know whether that's been done in the last 50 years.
Well, it's interesting when you were talking about those numbers and the amount of progress made just in the last 6 months. I said, wow. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at those numbers aren't really big given the population and size of the state of New York. And I know that there's been some concerns about, and a lot of discussions about, the slow rollout of those legal dispensaries. So when you look at, what is your thought if you look at 120, or you said, 140, or now up to 200, from 120 to up to 200?
Right. It'll be close to very close to 220 by today.
Okay. So it seems like things are really moving now, but the state historically seems to have struggled to open those cannabis stores at a sufficient pace.
Well, I mean, I agree that that's the narrative.
Right. And that's why I want to address. This is why we were so excited to have you on, because you read a lot of these headlines, and of course, look, this is a whole new thing to everybody, in every state. So it's like, you can't expect them to have all the answers immediately and to make these things happen quickly. And that's why I want to hear your perspective on this against the narrative.
If you realize, again, with what I started by saying, there were 20 of us that started. We had no office, we had no copier, we had no computers.
Right.
All those things then we have to hire. And once you hire, you're not hiring to full capacity just because that's the way the government works. If they say you can hire 220 people, they don't give you the funds for 220 because they feel you don't need them yet. We'll give them to you when you need them. From an operational perspective, when we need them, it's too late, right? Because at that point, it is a very long process to bring somebody on board. So that's one. There were no regulations. So there's a process. You have to draft regulations. You have to post regulations. You have to wait for comments to come back. You have to edit those. You have to have that sort of, that interaction with the public before you settle on what is going to be the final regs, and those get posted. One of the things that we knew for certain before we did anything, we knew we were going to get sued, right? Not because we were bad, but because every place that you've had this program, there have been lawsuits. Alabama is trying to start a medical cannabis program, and they've been held for like over a year with lawsuits. Wow. And that's just on the medical cannabis side. So we knew 100% that we were going to be sued. We just didn't know what aspect of what we did we were going to be sued on. As it turned out, because New York is such a competitive and desirable market, we were sued on everything. I actually have one episode, one of my longest ones, which was difficult, with just me and an attorney, and we go through every lawsuit some of them were constitutionally based, some of them were based on, discrimination, some, whatever. We had, I think at the time, something like 13 lawsuits. Wow. We had one where the judge enjoined, one of the very first ones, the judge enjoined the agency from continuing to process licenses, so we had to stop. So all of that has played in to the rollout. And again, remember, it's only 3 years ago that the statute was created. So I think at this point, it has been quite successul. So the other thing is that you have to grow this imbalance, and I think that's the thing that has frustrated a lot of people, a lot of lobbyists, right? People who got paid to have to complete applications for applicants, who got paid to lobby government on their behalf. That really played no role in our application review process and our recommendations to the Cannabis Control Board for licensure. So that was frustrating. So again, you have to grow the supply side and the retail side sort of at the same time. You can't have too much supply. You can't have too little supply. You can't have too many stores. Fortunately, for a while, we had too few stores, and that really, injured our farmers. But right now, we're pretty much in balance, across the supply chain. And that's the hope, is to grow it both, in balance, even if it means that we're going to be a little slower than we could be. If you went out and licensed all the retailers, a lot of them won't open stores because, again, there are restrictions on where they can open a location. So that's going to prevent some from being able to open easily. But you can't have too many stores and too few product, because that's going to raise the price of the products. You can't have too much product and not enough stores, because that's going to do damage also. So it's a tricky. You can't go, if we don't have enough product, we can't go to New Jersey and buy any, right? We have to stay within our bounds.
Right.
So we have to do this.
But Herb, that brings up sort of another interesting point, when you look at this, because I know that there was over 5,500 applications that were waiting to be reviewed not that long ago, and now they seem like you can see the pace really picking up now in New York. But meanwhile, while those applications are sitting in queue, and demand is probably not totally where it needs to be, or as far as supply and dispensary supply was running about one dispensary per like 150,000, which was deemed to be pretty far below demand. That's catching up now. But still, we've got this major problem of these legal dispensaries, because they've been, at that slow pace. There was estimates of somewhere between 2,008. I hear the number all over the place. 2,000 and 8,000 illegal shops in New York City alone. So you've got this. You've got the coming and accelerating legal market. Meanwhile, you've got these illicit markets. So how is that to be addressed? Because I know that's a big point of frustration to the legal shop owners.
Yeah. Well, and it is, and I think there's been a lot of ground gained in the last few months. Now, if you go back to the original legislation, the MRTA. Now think about it. The people that passed this, that negotiated. I mean, the majority leader of the state assembly. She was a guest on my first episode, and then the attorney who negotiated on behalf of the Governor Cuomo's administration was the guest on my last episode. So we really get the whole picture, and you had advocates that were putting this legislation together. So the enforcement aspect in the legislation was not very vibrant, right? So, and we did have an enforcement team, but the enforcement team at the time, the authority that we had in enforcement was really to deal with licensed entities. The enforcement team had no legal authority to act against illicit operators. Straight from our general counsel's office, everybody agreed. The legislation didn't allow us to do anything. I mean, we did send some cease and desist letters, but we didn't have the authority to walk in and seize products. We didn't have the authority.
They just got tossed
right.
in the trash.
Right, and that coincided, right? So this is 2022, beginning of 2022. It really hadn't happened like this anywhere else, but it really just took off, and the word everybody used was proliferation. I try to find a synonym for it that would do it justice, but proliferation was the only word that really made sense for how fast these stores proliferated. So at one point, I think the estimate was about 3,000 in New York City alone. So there were two bites at that apple. So the legislature came back in session and gave us a little bit more authority. And then this past April 2024, there was more of an all-encompassing legislation that authorized, that gave authority to OCM to padlock. If they went into a shop and they found illicit cannabis, they could padlock it. And they also gave authority to local law enforcement, which was non-existent previously. So now NYPD could go in, a sheriff in an upstate county could go in, and they had the same authority to padlock.
Yeah, and I know, like millions of dollars of fines were levied, but very few of them have actually been paid.
Right. No, and there's a process for that, and both with the agency at OCM and with the city. The city also has an office called the Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings, and they process a lot of these claims as well. So it's a process. I mean, we can't just snatch the money.
Yeah.
So they're going through that process now.
Yeah, and I think one of the things is that that always comes up when I talk to cannabis regulators, even in other states, is there seems to be this trying to find the right balance between regulation and empowerment, right? Because here, when they look at this in New York and you say, "Gosh, you're not even forcing these illegal folks out, and you're imposing regulations on us." But I know that's not the way you think about it and the way that regulators think about it. You're thinking about, yes, we have to balance this regulation with empowering these companies to actually be successful. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think again with the illicit operators, there's care not to recriminalize this activity. So that's one, and whether that's good or bad, it's it really is a philosophy that I think we definitely have here in New York, and I think most regulators across the country have. So we don't want to lock people up again for this kind of stuff.
Right.
So I think what the agency can do, and I think, and I've talked to on the retail side as well, is just to really try to make that distinction to the consumer, right? Because ultimately it's the consumer that's choosing. In New York, I refuse to believe, even though people tell me that they can't tell the difference. I've gone into the illicit ones and I've gone to the legal ones. They're two completely different looking stores, right? One is like a candy store with all kinds of stuff. It's very small. They might still be plexiglass around the store, that kind of thing. You go to a licensed dispensary, it's like, people refer to it like going to an Apple store, like a Sephora. It's a very elegant looking store by comparison. So I can't believe that you can't tell the difference. Then, one of the things that we did was we actually created a sticker, right? That you would put on your window or your door, saying this is a licensed store. There's a license that has to be posted, for the public to see. So one of the things really is to educate the public about, visiting, what the benefits are of going to a legal store as opposed to going to an illicit store. So the taxes, hopefully the safety, because it's a tested product. There's money that's being reinvested into the community, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a job for all of us, I think, to continue to do that.
Yeah, it just seems to me that consumers, when you say you can tell the difference, you and I could certainly tell the difference because we've been in a lot of licensed and non-licensed. So I think you can immediately see the difference. But the average consumer doesn't understand those things. So how can you provide the kind of support and education that's not only going to help the consumers, but also help the industry to help tell the difference?
Well, I think, and I said this when I was there. I mean, there's got to be a budget for PSAs, for there's a lot of work that the agency does online on their website. But if you don't go to the website, you don't see that. There's actually a brand new tool that they put out about a week ago called Local, and it has a long name, but the acronym is Local. And you plug in an address, if it's your home address, and it'll show you every licensed store within 5 miles or whatever range you put in. So there's a lot of work that they're doing, but they're not communicating on the radio, they're not communicating on TV. That's a budget issue. I think it's
So
something.
it's a great app nobody knows exists, right? It's a great
exactly. Right? So unless you follow, and everybody that follows it say, "Wow, this is a great app," because it's also helpful for new licensees, right? They want to see where for the proximity protection issue, which is that you have to be a certain distance from schools, from churches, and from other dispensaries. So if you're looking for space, that's a good thing to be able to determine. So that you're already violating one of those rules. But yeah, everybody who sees it loves it, but you have to know it's there, and communicating to the public on a broad scale, that's going to take some real money. But I think easily will be made up by increased tax revenue.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when you look at this, so you could say that the demand is being covered, particularly in New York City, because of the unlicensed as well as the licensed. So how does, and I believe that those things will start to police itself and solve itself. Those, that's going to get better. We're going to see the legal come up. We're going to see the illegal go down. I see the effort going on there, but from the perspective of how you guarantee that there's not either under supply or oversaturation, I mean, how do you figure that out?
I don't, but they're very smart people at the OCM who do this. One of my concerns, I didn't have a cannabis background. One of my big concerns coming in, especially to an operations role, I could set up these systems, but knowing those exact things, I was afraid we would be outclassed, outgunned by the industry. But we were very fortunate. We got people who were very knowledgeable. A lot of people I think that the term for them are cannabis refugees. People from New York who had gone to other states to work. They wanted to work in cannabis. They graduated college, wanted to experience in cannabis, and they went out west. A lot of them were back home because of COVID. So when we started opening up and started posting jobs, we got a ton of people with experience in Colorado and California, people who were growing and working illicitly in New York. So those people who were working in investments, in cannabis investment, John Casio, who's the director of policy, just brilliant, and they know this stuff. I didn't know it, but they know it, and they can figure it out.
So they can figure all that out. And what you talked about, sort of in these other states, what do you think? You've talked before, and we've had a conversation about looking at what other states are doing. And so, what do you think we could learn from other states, and how those other states could serve as a model for improving things in New York?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, we looked at the other states that were legal before us to figure out how we were going to set up in New York. One of the things that gave us in New York the idea of centering equity was that we didn't want it to be an add-on, like other states had legalized cannabis, and then at some point after added equity as a concept. We centered it right from the beginning. So I think that was that we learned a lot of things. Again, we learned that we were going to be sued. We knew we were going to be sued. There were some constitutional issues that I think we avoided because of lawsuits in other jurisdictions. I think other jurisdictions are looking at New York to see what they can do. The one thing that I've heard, I know in Delaware, what I've heard is that the way that they're going to fund their equity is through a bond referendum, and they'll have the taxes pay for the cost of the bonds and the interest. In New York, we tried the private equity model, and we tried it at a time when, unfortunately, interest rates were just zooming. So it didn't work out in New York to go the private equity route. It wasn't a route that I was particularly interested in going anyway. But I think looking at something like that to raise the capital for us to distribute, I think we could use things like or institutions like credit unions. Instead of recreating a loan process, right, and hiring someone, we could just deposit the funds with a credit union, and they have the infrastructure to issue loans and collect loans and do all of that. There's no need to recreate that.
Yeah, so you're getting into a little bit of futurism there, and where do you see the industry going? I mean, what's your predictions on how this is going to evolve, both at a state and federal level?
For me, and I know there's a lot of the talk about the whether it's going to go from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, et cetera, et cetera. I kind of would like things to stay the way they are for a while, to let New York sort of gain in knowledge and creativity and product, right? I'm not sure. I would hate to start having to compete with other states nationally, at this young stage of development in New York. So a couple of years worth of experience under the belt in New York, I think, would be helpful. And then I think, anybody in New York can compete with anybody across, country or the world. So I would hope for things not to move as fast. And we don't know what's going to happen in Washington in the next couple of weeks or next couple of years. So I'm not that optimistic that things will move very quickly there. So that's fine. I think New York will really just take off next year. I think, despite all the noise that came out of New York earlier this year, I think this is, what you're seeing now, and the pace of growth that you're seeing now is really the result of the seeds that were laying, by Chris Alexander and Axel Burnaby and everybody that was there at the start of the agency. It takes time. Brian, you said something about the state, opening retail, but the state doesn't open. All we can do is issue licenses.
Right.
It's up to the licensee to issue.
Maybe I was confused with Canada.
No, but I think one of the things that happened is that when the New York governor came out and in March of 2022 and talked about all this funding being available, and we were going to have a turnkey operation, just get a license and we'll give you a store. I think that brought in applicants that really were not prepared to run stores, didn't have the capital, didn't have the the ability just to open up a store on their own. And there was no the only bar was the $2,000 to apply.
Right.
So once that didn't appear, we had all these licensees that had nowhere to go. If we had gone the route of taking the initial, I think the governor put in $50 million into the pot, and then the private equity was supposed to bring in another $150 million. If we would have used that $50 million for low interest loans or even grants, I think it would have been a lot more successful. I think a lot more of those. Originally, I think it was close to 500 licensees from that conditional adult use retail dispensary. Those are the ones that had to have the cannabis conviction, but they also had to have business experience, 2 years of profitable business experience. So I think if we would have just left it at that, I think we'd have a smaller number of applicants that would have had the wherewithal to actually open those stores to begin with.
Well, you've got a lot of experience. You bring a very unique perspective, obviously an experienced one of actually on the legal and regulatory side of this and the operational side of it as well. And that's why we are really excited to have you on. And I know you're doing some work out there, so certainly tell our listeners about how you're helping out there in the industry and how they can get in touch with you.
Well, at this point, and I do have a bar against representing anyone before the agency, so that's up in June. So I haven't been doing that. I did begin this podcast, which I had no experience, no interest in doing when I first left. But again, I sort of felt compelled when all these stories were coming out and not for me to get up there and say, oh, no, they're wrong, but to really bring people who were benefiting, right? People who were licensees, people who were working in the industry, and have them tell the story of how, that it has been successful for them, that they would not have been able to participate in a legal cannabis market if it wasn't for the program that we created. So those people told a great story. And then we covered issues like cannabis and driving, right? It's
Right.
you have alcohol and driving all the time, but that really hasn't made a big discussion. And then one of my favorites was with a New York Times editor who wrote a book on alcohol prohibition. So we talk a lot about the similarities between alcohol prohibition, really, and 100 years later, cannabis prohibition, and it's exactly the same story, same states, same arguments. Really, just fascinating. So anyway, so the podcast is a joint session, Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis. And we just wrapped up the first season, 14 episodes. Really, in retrospect, when I look now at the titles and the stories, it really is a history of what's happened in New York State from that March 31, 2021 until now.
I got to check out the one where you're talking about the all the lawsuits and diving into them. That sounds interesting as well. So
Oh, no, it was great.
yeah, so that's great. Well, you've got a lot of knowledge. I have really enjoyed getting to know you and learning about your background, and I think you do have a lot to offer towards the future. And so I think your podcast is a wonderful resource, and I hope our listeners tag onto that as well. So thanks for joining us, Herb. I think it's been a wonderful session, and we look forward to talking more with you in the future.
Oh, same here. I was a little nervous. I'm not used to being on this side of it. So thank you very much.
There you
Thank
go.
you, Taylor and Joy. I know Joy's back there somewhere.
Yeah, she is.
She's been great.
Well, we really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you for our broadcast next week.
Thank you.